Welcome to Extremism Channel with myself, Mr. J. Bora. Today, I really want to talk on the subject of safeguarding children and young people from extremism. And I think, given take the current events that are happening internationally, there are a lot of challenges for professionals working with children, young people in a wide range of sectors, different settings. So therefore, I just really want to present to us in this show to talk around some considerations that we do really need to explore and revisit and take on board. Particularly myself having experiences in these sectors and working in prevent and delivering prevent and consultations to training. And it's something that I also equally had written about in a publication called Safeguarding from Extremism Post 7/7, the July bombings in the UK, which opened a whole new dimension, particularly by bringing safeguarding and into counter-terrorism landscapes and the frameworks and infrastructures that crossed over, information and services that had to collaborate. But historically, in England, we know way back from, say, the 16th century onwards, the church had a very big responsibility in protecting children, particularly those that were homeless and accommodating them, ensuring that their well-being was maintained. And then essentially as time progressed and this urgency to help children and young people became paramount significant. In 1889, for example, the Prevention of Cruelty to and Protection of Children Act was, and the Children's Charter was passed by Parliament, recognizing also the need to protect children. And I'm discussing all this to bring it into the context of extremism. And therefore, police could arrest anyone and enter people's homes where children were at danger. So these developments began to happen. That prompted another series of legislations over the years, and the same we saw in 1889 with the formation of the NSPCC, National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and the Poor Law was introduced, and subsequent to that we've had the Life Preservation Act and other areas, and reviews came into place, and given take the death of children, people in the hands of families or carers or parents came along, which was very severe when we had definition and things that have been expanded upon, saying from the Home Office, we had Social Services Department installed. Same with 1973, the death of Maria Colwell, again opened a whole new dimension. We see in the 1989 Act, Children Act was introduced, and child protection committees and all these other areas that were introduced as departments installed for the purpose of protecting children and young people. And in terms of the Children Act and the welfare principle, and we talk about the well-being of the child, Section 1 being very paramount to the work that a lot of people are doing in a lot of different sectors, whether it's in retail, cinema, sports, social services, education, religious institutions. It's critically important, and I'll be explaining it as I go along and here on the channel. Now, therefore, we also saw a lot of elevation with other different types of legislation, the care standards and Adoption and Children Act, the Children Act of 2004, which introduced children safeguarding boards. There was a lot of areas that needed to be opened up. However, in 2003, and that was really where the 2004 Act came along, the death of Victoria Climby, and I think a lot of people listening to this will be able to relate to that, opened a whole new scope and introduced a whole new wide range of areas. And I want to quote something that was very interesting, what Lord Lamming had said. He said in 2003, a report to the government, and I'm quoting from the publication here. On the death of Victoria Climby, Lord Lamming stated that I recognise that those who take on the work of protecting children at risk of deliberate harm face a tough and challenging task. Now, listen to what he's saying here. Adults who deliberately exploit the vulnerability of children can behave in devious and menacing ways. They will go to great lengths to hide their activities from those concerned for the well-being of a child. And you can start to think around extremes and documentation and prevent and want to try and connect it together. And staff have to balance the rights of a parent with that of the protection of the child. That's what Lord Lamming had mentioned. And we can also talk around Professor Monroe and her review of child protection and everything, particularly in England. And the House of Commons Education Committee fourth report in session 2012-13, which is called Children First, the Child Protection System in England, of the Monroe Review, with reference, and I'm quoting again, to Conduct Inquiry 6 years, stressed that to identify children at risk of different forms of abuse and exploitation including but not limited or restricted to child trafficking online. And she goes further to say, she summed up the complex challenge. It is not enough to identify abuse or neglect. Signs and symptoms are absolutely, obviously, at times quite ambiguous, and we can see, and I think we can relate to some mentalities. Now we've got a problem because if children are being raised by their families, and we're talking about extremism and the impact of extremism as a form of abuse. We could talk about the different categories of abuse, and I quoted Lord Lamming there. We can talk around sexual, physical, emotional, financial, but to what extent are we going to compare sexual abuse to, say, emotional abuse when it comes to extremism and preventing counter-terrorism agenda? To what extent are children being exploited, say, physically as opposed to psychologically? So these are the areas that we need to consider. Now, also the Children Act, by reason of Section 17(1), states that so far was consistent with the duty here of the Children Act to promote the upbringing of such children by their parents by providing a range and level of services appropriate to those children in need. So what is that saying to us? Essentially, but it's also challenging because if we are saying or suggesting that a child should be brought up with the family, which is right, and when that encompasses a good family network, what about if parents are the perpetrators or parents have been known to be, if I can use that word, suspects of terrorist security intelligence agencies who have groomed and radicalizing their own children to engage in marches, whether it's the far right, whether it's the extremism, whether it's online, whether it's via mobile, whether they're taken to particular religious institutions to get that kind of education. Are they still safe? Are they still protected? Or are they being exposed? Now, this is the challenge that we've got here because give and take the services and the needs and the failures and significant failures to protect children over the years, over the decades. Our history has also informed us. And professionals should be aware of all these in terms of assessment frameworks. What about the things like assessment frameworks and looking at all the areas of assessment and the children that is in need and requires protection, and requires to be in a place far from abuse or harm or neglect? What about their well-being? We can talk about the CAF, the Common Assessment Frameworks, where people work in these areas. We can talk about the 5 outcomes or the Every Child Matters, which has been strongly aligned to United Nations rights and the children, and the Charter, free from torture, of give the right to education. These are the areas that need to be considered, and no doubt these discussions began to take place and accelerate. And we're talking about safeguarding children from extreme children, young people from extremism, began to accelerate post 7/7. The discussions were there, 9/11, and in my observations and having been able to have these kind of discussions and deliver the training and working in preventative and early prevention, which is what it's all about, which these reviews or recommendations from Parliament or other governing bodies. We could talk about documentation of working to safeguard children and young people documentation. It is very critical and important to understand some of the messages are the same. Some of the messages just keep repeating themselves around communication, early prevention and assessment, judgments, because essentially the judgment of a particular situation, condition or a risk or a potential threat lies with the professional, lies with the individual concerned, whether you're going into a house, whether you're doing a visit somewhere else, whether it's in a public space, disclosed away from individuals. You are in essence assessing a risk there, a possible risk, or could be a possible on the reverse of failure in the process to protect a child. So far as say extremism is concerned, which has a lot of abuse, exposure to materials and images and you name it, is very damaging. And therefore, taking that on board, when the prevent agenda was taken and came out, it was to prevent radicalization and the risk of terrorism escalating in the UK. But therefore, extremism is a bit more subtle now because with extremism, we're talking about an ideology. We're talking about how do people go and recruit individuals for a particular cause. Yes, we know what the former head of MI5, sorry, had said, Jonathan Evans and others in that same role, about the risk from targeting of from terrorist groups to recruit children and people because they're more vulnerable. We talk about the criminal age of responsibility being under 10. Can they be convicted of a crime? These are all things that they have to take in consideration, knowing that they will not be so much on the radar because they didn't pose much of a risk, much of a threat, particularly in terms of engaging, say, in a terrorist act, as opposed to them becoming radicalized, which was the objective of people like Bin Laden and other groups, even within the UK, from within the UK, having training camps and getting children and young people, which is what we see in the Middle East and other countries, being trained and recruited. Kids as young as 5 years old holding Kalashnikovs. These are images and perceptions, for example, that people are seeing on a daily basis, that people, therefore, we can see they're being groomed for that. We talk about sexual exploitation and grooming. Therefore, we need to look and explore that, and again, in light of the safeguarding of children and people. What are the early indications? What are the signs we talk about? We can refer people to Channel and all these other organizations that have to make assessment. But by the time you get to that process, could be weeks or months or even arguably years. But by that time, the individual may have already been radicalized, become radicalized. So therefore, we need to now look more closely at making a quicker, clearer judgment upon a particular individual. Again, that's what William Shawcross said in the Prevent review that was published, talking around the Prevent duty guidance and other documentations need to be explored again, need to be opened up again. It gives the key areas looking at IT and staffing and training. But also, we need to equip the schools and the knowledge of a worker to look at certain indications and signs and not misread them, not misinterpret them as potentials for radicalization, as potential for someone adopting extremist ideology, or even at worst case scenario, someone engaging in, say, towards an act of terrorism or wanted to join a particular group. And we've seen the cases, particularly in England, that people have left at the age of 14 and 15 and traveled. And that's extensively happened in Europe, and people have joined groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS and others, and particularly now with what's happening with Hamas and other groups. So therefore, we have to understand now how do we approach it? Because when David Cameron in the coalition government established certain departments, and there's been a lot it's installed since July 7/7 in England. Departments installed, and we talk about the Channel. We can talk about Extreme Task Force Group, which David Cameron set up to look at things like online grooming. The Extreme Task Force Group also talked about set out practical proposals to tackle extremism in the following areas, and I'll quote them. He talked about disrupting extremists, countering extremist narratives and ideologies, preventing radicalization. It's about interpretation. It's about stopping extremism in institutions, including schools, university, and further educations. They were really clearly the vision or the aim was to really identify areas where all current approach was lacking and to agree practical steps to fight against all forms of extremism. This message has not changed. This focus has not changed, particularly within working with children and young people in a wide range of settings, whether it's in a residential sector, people that may be going out to meet individuals, or independents where they exercise more independence. And because they exercise more independence, they can make their own choices. Before, there was a dependency on parents and professionals to make choices for them, or what is prescribed in documentations or law as far as it was safe to do so. But where do you get to the point where they make their own choices? Now, the Prevent strategy, again, is trying to achieve the objectives as set out in contest and how contests are being reformed, which is to tackle, and I'm quoting again, to tackle the cause of radicalization and respond to the ideological challenge of terrorism. Safeguard, again, the word come up, safeguard, and support those most at risk of radicalization through early intervention. This is key and critical for services delivering that intervention, identifying them and offering them support if they're willing to take, because initially Prevent was a voluntary engagement until the CTSA 2015 came along, Counterterrorism Security Act, gave it statutory footing and power. And it also enables those who have already engaged in terrorism to disengage and rehabilitate. We can talk about de-radicalization, counter-radicalization, and all the other terms if people is in that process. But there's got to be a point somewhere along where someone may still want to engage in it for whatever reason. Because when we're talking about children and young people, they come from a wide range of racial, cultural, diverse backgrounds, and we have to tread very carefully. This is a challenge for professionals in safeguarding children and people. Challenge very carefully. Say someone who's come from a religious home, has a lot of religious views, reads a lot of books, for someone who may not have come from a religious home, a bit more traditional for that matter. We're comparing the two. Which one's going to be at a higher risk then, as far as knowledge or exposure is concerned? Particularly when Prevent talks around, it's about a vocal and active opposition to fundamental values or British values. Are British values at the core of certain religions? Give and take, we're talking about a Christian country, or are they not? And this is some of the areas that we see a failure or an alienation of, say, children and young people. We've seen riots in this country in 2011, reason because of the social and economic challenges and crises which we're currently facing. A lot of it were entering the criminal justice system. We see it in gangs culture, people embracing gang because of lack of parenting, the father figure, or other factors for that matter. A broken home, there were challenges there with that. Are all these precursors towards somebody becoming radicalized or who are already adopting a view of extremism, thinking that they're isolated or marginalized at the micro level? To the point where they feel that joining a particular group gives them the power and the status that they've been looking for or longing for that was lacking because of their self-esteem for that matter. Therefore, these are areas that we need to consider when approaching safeguarding and children and young people from extremism. There are other areas, as far as say recruitment is concerned, and in my view, and my professional view, or even academic, having completed my master's in terrorism, crime, and global security, I find there were approaches that I'll be discussing on the show around tactics around extremism recruitment. And I see there's three areas that are very, very key that we need to be looking. And these are also evident in research, in psychology researches, and other areas of templates and models. And I'll be talking about some of these models on the show. There's things like casual approaches, and there's focused approach to recruitment, and there's a targeted approach. In casual, maybe your everyday conversations, with general conversations, there's no point intended, it's just triggered off in the school, in the playground, on a bus, wherever the person may be. However, there are the next stage of that is when someone is gonna look for someone, they have a casual conversation to assess where they are. The next stage is then they look at a focused approach. Let me focus on a particular subject now. Let me see the view on a particular subject. I've put multiple subjects out there. I've put multiple discussions, and I found the areas of where they find there's some sort of grievance, where there's more anger. I can see more regression coming out. So I'll use that. And I will see, say, in Hamas or the Middle East or Ukraine or which other historically, which everything that the person uses, political, religious, or ideological. Then they move to more a focused approach. These are tactics from extremists. They're very, very clear in how they want to recruit individuals. So therefore, they move to more focused and start to open up that subject area, open that focus a bit more, and then it's more targeted. So if someone knows someone goes to a particular school and they want to recruit them from within the school, they know where to go. So they target that every afternoon, every evening. There is a targeted approach. So these are the stages I see that is risky and challenging for us, as far as recruitment is concerned, because recruitment is a wide open space. It's a wide open space. It happens. Even David Anderson, one of the independent reviewers of terrorism laws in the UK, having met him myself in interviews, it was equally important when he wrote his report about where some terrorists were found in local cafes and parks, and they were planning and plotting against the UK. These are areas that we need to focus on now. The next generation, give and take, there have been threats made to the UK because of all the events of Israel and Hamas. To target the UK again, we've seen history repeat itself, but this time, who are they going to recruit? Why would they want to recruit again, or go through a campaign, even though we have laws in place now, terror laws that prevent, and I talked about terror laws already, extremism laws, you can watch that show. Therefore, are these in place now? But does that stop people recruiting? Does that stop radicalization? No, it doesn't. It still will continue. There was a lot of open space now, and give and take all the marches that have been taking place, there are a lot of people collaborating upon the same line of thinking. So it's bringing people together as opposed to dispersing. It's really integrating people or bringing that cohesion them together. However, far as say the children and young people are concerned, but don't people work in certain sectors, and we're talking about risk assessments and observations that we got to make and decisions you got to make and certain judgments you have to do. So we have to really now really make note of what are we seeing? Are there patterns? Are there trends that are consistent? Are there certain discussions? I know in all the training that the Home Office and others give, they talk about push and pull factors. But we need to go a bit more deeper because we're looking at abuse. We're looking at the extent of abuse of a vulnerable child or a young person at the hands of a potential extremist, whether it's a parent, family, teacher, no matter. One of the July bombers, Sadiq Khan, was a youth worker. So you see his background, he had very much influence with children and young people in these kind of settings. I'm not saying that may happen again, but we've got to look very carefully at why some of these people are having this kind of discussion with young people. Are they having these discussions to challenge or disrupt or undermine an extremist ideology? Or are they having these discussions to find out where they are? And I talked about the casual approach, focused approach, and the targeted approach. Are these where people are looking now And our safeguards and our understanding around safeguarding needs to be focused in that particular area. We could talk about the use of police, for example, in child protection to move someone. However, how quickly can you move someone who's just having a general discussion that can lead to radicalization? And this is what we need to be alert to, particularly in terms of safeguarding children and young people. And I quoted Lord Laming earlier. He mentioned this cannot be limited on Professor Monroe. However, people working in these particular areas, having done it myself, I was very clear and succinct when I used to hear certain views come out. I used to want to unpack them views and say to myself, now, where could this lead to? What are the dangers with this? What are the benefits of this? How can we alter that perception? Does it mean now, particularly from safeguarding children and young people, do we need now to develop more analytical skills? As Dr. Brooks from King's College once said, that's quoted in the publication, develop more analytical skills. What about the use of understanding these areas from Sigmund Freud's perspective? I mean, it was also equally. We talk about how the media can radicalize kids. It was children that were watching violent scenes from Child's Play 3, the Chucky that horror film, where they watched this film, and then as a result of watching that, they enacted all that out and killing that young James Bulger, that young boy, which changed the major overhaul of criminal responsibility in the UK. That was simply by watching a film on TV, Child's Play 3. So, what are the perceptions? How are they processing all this? How they're interpreting all this? Are they is it glamorous? Do you feel that there's a sense of power in extremism and terrorism, a sense of glorification, particularly with the religious narrative that is at the end of that, or that tunnel, which seems really to be misleading or misguiding some of the generation that we are currently dealing with. And we've seen all these quotes from previous MPs, and we've got Rishi Sunak and others who have spoken around the same thing, around disrupting it, the challenges with all that. We have bills in Parliament. But at the front line, it is a dangerous thing, and it's particularly challenging protecting them from that. So, which is why now the whole area around the new approach or the challenge approach that's currently taking place, we have to revisit a lot of these areas and take into consideration now that we have to also now quickly move quicker than we did before, because recruitment is happening at a faster pace. It seems as though radicalization will be happening at a faster pace. Years ago, we never had so many marches like this take place with so many hundreds. We're talking 250,000 possibly. So therefore, these are the areas we have to look at and focus upon the dangers and risks espoused to the young people, particularly in the areas where I've said we've got to focus on emotional abuse and psychological abuse, particularly in forms of material compared to other areas, and the financial abuse of, say, for example, resources, children, young people funding that and willing to pay towards it, or go on a spree of criminal activity to raise funds, and that is tied into legislation. I hope this understands us to have this discussion around children, young people at risk of extremism, and there's areas that I will unpack within this particular channel around this in a bit more depth, particularly around recruitment and extremism recruitment, which I mentioned the 3 areas, which I will go into a bit more depth. But this will stimulate conversation, no doubt, and get us to think that we really need to be focusing our efforts a lot more and being a bit more firm on the challenges and going into more depth around understanding extremist ideologies, whatever settings they present themselves. Thank you for watching.